And today I couldn't be more excited to have a conversation about not only connectivity, but the resilience that makes Puerto Rico so special. First, I will start by giving Catherine an opportunity just to introduce herself, to talk a little bit about the work with Libraries Without Libraries Without Borders, and especially their commitment to Puerto Rico. But I just want to thank you guys in advance for being here. And for the people who are tuning into this conversation, we are going to set aside a few minutes at the end should you have any questions. And I encourage you to use the chat because we'll weave those into the conversation. So thanks again for joining us. And Catherine, tell us about Libraries Without Borders.
Hi, thank you, Francella. Thank you for the opportunity and everybody who's joining us today. So my name is Kat Trujillo. I'm the Deputy Director at Libraries Without Borders, and we're an international nonprofit that works to expand access to information and education around the world. So I'm with the US office, which is based here in DC, and our focus here is creating pop-up libraries and learning spaces in unconventional areas. So for instance, our flagship program is called the Wash and Learn Initiative, and it's basically setting up pop-up libraries and learning spaces inside laundromats. So that's one of our biggest programs. But we also have a program in Puerto Rico where in Loíza specifically, where we have our signature tool, which is called the Ideas Box. And it's everything that you need to set up a library infrastructure anywhere in the world, regardless of whether or not you have access to electricity, internet. It has satellite internet connectivity. It comes with its own generator, and it comes with books, a number of things. Basically, it creates a library anywhere in the world. And we've been able to set up one of these inside a community center in Loíza. We've since expanded and are working on providing connectivity to 3 community centers in Loíza with a focus on digital and health literacy to help people see the connections between learning digital literacy skills and being able to access better healthcare services. So that's a little bit about me and Libraries Without Borders, but I'll hand it back over to you, Francella.
Well, I'm so excited that we get to not only honor the work that's happening in Puerto Rico, but also your organization's commitment to it. And now I'll tell you a little bit about how I met the commissioner. It actually started last year when we were working on a BDAC committee for the FCC. And our task was to document essentially what happened in COVID. What did it feel like? What were community level perspectives? How did our networks perform? And really, what did we need? What do we learn? What do we need? Mm-hmm. And it was really exciting to be able to see her in action because she's more of a diplomat than I am in those broadband circles. I think that one of the things that really made me proud was her willingness to elevate the connectivity experiences of people in Puerto Rico and to make sure that we recognize that making room for other voices at the table actually makes all of us better. I was always thinking about opportunities to connect with her and find out more about how we could be more inclusive. And that's actually how I got connected with people in Guam, American Samoa, a nudge to get in touch with people in Hawaii, also the Virgin Islands, which actually inspired our last newsletter to make sure that we're talking about connectivity for all Americans, not just Americans on the mainland. The commissioner has been active in lots of different work groups, whether it be with NTIA or NARUC. She's actually serves currently as an associate member of the Puerto Rico Public Service Regulatory Board. That is a public service commission that oversees energy, telecommunications, transportation, and other essential services for Puerto Rico. She's also a state broadband leader representative at the State Broadband Leaders Network and the Digital Leaders Network of NTIA. She represents Puerto Rico in NTIA, in NARUC discussions, has spent years practicing telecommunications as counsel and also as a hearing examiner. And we couldn't be more excited just to hear from her today. So without further ado, please welcome Commissioner Fernandez Navarro.
Thank you, Francella. Thank you for inviting me. This is a most pleasurable honor for me to be able to contact with both of you and with the people who are joining us. It's great to tell Puerto Rico's story.
Yay.
I think it's a wonderful story.
It is. And I'll start by just letting Kat get us started with the questions. And again, for those of you who are tuning in, if you have questions, please do drop them in the chat.
All right, I'll kick us off. So we know that Puerto Rico's telecommunications infrastructure was unreliable in many parts of the island prior to Hurricanes Maria and Irma, but how did that change after? What was the impact of the storms on daily life? And how did that differ for communities on the coast versus those in mountainous areas of the island?
Well, I think Hurricane Maria brought forth some very obvious truth to us who were working on telecommunications. The first was that telecommunication is an essential service. I think when we think of utilities, we think more of water and electricity. And when Hurricane Maria happened, 95% of Puerto Rico was left without comms. The whole island was left without electricity. And so governmental communications fell along with private networks. And so everybody realized finally that telecommunications are necessary to deal with everyday affairs. And so that was one of the first things that happened. And after the passing of Hurricane Maria, we actually got a law, Act 5 of 2018, that recognized that telecommunications is an essential service. The second thing that happened was that we realized that the systems that we have, the networks that we have, infrastructure was not as robust or redundant as we needed it to be. And the third thing that happened was that the digital divide that we knew existed became apparent to everybody. If people are not know Puerto Rico that well, Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean with a central mountainous system. Most people live in the metropolitan area because the jobs are there. But there are lots of people in the mountainous areas that were literally incommunicated because they had no access to roads. We had landslides and roads gave way. And we also had no comms. And so when you're asking what happened to the people in the mountainous regions, people were left without access to the basic necessities of life, whether it be comms, transportation, food, water, electricity. And we had to make sure that that never happens again. So I would say those are the things that were most eventful after Hurricane Maria. And so we had to begin thinking about when we are going to rebuild, how is it that we're going to rebuild? Who should be at the table deciding that, what things should be taken into consideration, and are we going to build back the same way, or are we going to build back in a better way? You add to that, after Hurricane Maria, we had earthquakes in the southern part of the island. We also had the COVID situation. All of that has brought forth new challenges, but also new opportunities about how to go and do things for the people of Puerto Rico.
Building on something that you just said, when you were thinking about, you guys thinking about how you were going to rebuild, what role did the companies that essentially descended onto the island with lots of help and ideas and resources, what role did they play in that rebuild? And to what extent did you bring in new local voices into thinking about what that new network looked like?
Well, being an island and having comms and airports and the ports were left without communication. So we had inventory on the island, but that inventory is taxed. And so there wasn't a lot of inventory, and most of it, was lost. And so this help from outsiders became a lifeblood for all Puerto Ricans, whether it be food, water, or telecommunication infrastructure materials. And so the real issue we had was, how do we prioritize all of this help that is coming to the island? What should be given number one priority, whether it be water, food, all of these issues. But the wonderful thing, because I always think that bad things, tend to bring blessings too. The wonderful thing that happened was that for the first time in our history, at least in the communication sector, we all sat down in a dedicated emergency command center to make decisions about how we would go into restoring comms. And when I meet everybody, was the government, the providers, the tower owners, and the federal partners, NTIA, FCC, the Secret Service, Homeland Security. Everybody sat down on that dedicated center. We spent about 4 months in that center before we moved someplace else. And for the first time, we got to know each other, and we got to know each other by name, and we got to understand who does what and how it integrates into a master plan. And we got to see where the infrastructure was. We created maps, and we began sharing information about Puerto Rico.
So you kind of touched upon this more at the global level, but what did local governments do to improve network resilience?
Well, this is something important, since every municipality had their communications, they didn't have any. We got the most important thing that they did, we got them to waive their permitting processes for the restoration. One of the big issues in Puerto Rico is we have 78 municipalities, and we have a central permitting system, but according to the authority that the municipalities have, they can have their own systems. And so you would basically have, for restoration, 78 different books on how to go about permitting. And that is a very, difficult path to go through, but particularly you want to restore things fast. And so it's not the time to go through the 20-page processing permitting process. So we got them to all of 78 municipalities waive their regular processes, and they said for a period of time, it wasn't forever, just so that the telcos could start providing, getting to the business of raising comms, which was so important. I think that's one of the most important things that happened, that local communities did.
So when you're thinking about after the storms, you get back into a place where you feel like you have better communication, better information sharing, and even better data. Here comes COVID. And how do you think that COVID maybe interfered with your plans or even exacerbated the digital divide that you already knew existed?
Well, I think COVID brought about the second part of the equation. Everybody thinks about deploying infrastructure, nobody thinks about the people who use it. And so with COVID, you got a chance to really see the amount of people who have no hardware to use for this infrastructure, who don't know how to use the infrastructure, and who have no money to pay for the services. And so I think COVID brought that, to the forefront. That's a problem that we knew existed. But then again, at that time, because we have done, in 2012, Puerto Rico began with a broadband plan, and in 2015, it was updated. So we knew there was a digital divide. And most people said that they did not realize that what the digital world could bring to their everyday. So they were not vested on it. But with COVID-19, people realized that they needed it just as much as they need electricity or water. But then comes the hard part. I don't have the means to use it. I don't have a computer. I don't have money to pay $90 a month for servicing. I don't know. And then if I have it, I don't know how to use it. And if I have technical difficulties, who do I go to for this? And so I think that's what COVID-19 has brought here and in the United States, the continental states.
You mentioned that there was this shift from getting people to realize or be vested in the use of broadband internet. So now that, COVID-19 has ushered that in, and people recognize this need, who have been some of the most instrumental partners to deploy broadband in unserved or underserved areas of Puerto Rico?
Well, we have a lot of NGOs that are doing, like you, their work, but I think we have a partner in the FCC who created the Uniendo Puerto Rico Fund, which is a dedicated fund. They have one, the same one for the US Virgin Islands. And I think that came about because of the visits that we received from Chairman Pai and now Chairwoman Rosenwerzer. They came to Puerto Rico. And after this past year, Commissioner Starks, I think when you see the reality of bringing broadband to this island versus, let's say, Kansas or Dakota, North or South Dakota, you realize that it's not the same. You realize the impact of what you do or the rulemaking procedures that you take on, the definitions that you choose to apply. And it gives you a sense of the reality of another part of the United States. And so I think that was instrumental, that will be instrumental, that process, stage 2. The winners were announced a couple of months ago, and they're about to start. It's a 10-year program for fixed and 3-year program for mobile. But also, and I'm glad to say, we have not talked about this, but this is the reality. Puerto Rico has just begun a Puerto Rico broadband infrastructure fund. It's from money from Puerto Rico. It's a $400 million fund, which will be spent in the next 3 years. It's according to Chapter 7 of PROMESA, the fiscal plan for Puerto Rico. And that is being put out by AFAF, which is the agency that deals with the fiscal matters in Puerto Rico. And that has just begun. We are now in the process of choosing an administrator for that fund. And that fund particularly is dedicated to serve and unserved communities in Puerto Rico. That's its whole goal. And I have been waiting for this for a lot of years. And I tell you the importance of it. It's not the amount of the money, it's because for the first time, the government of Puerto Rico has seen telecommunications, particularly broadband, as an economic motor for development of its people. I think that's a giant step forward. It's not just, dialing a cell phone. It's not just, watching Netflix. It's not just a utility. It's the capacity that utility has in transforming the lives of people. I think that is a major, major step forward for Puerto Rico. And I'm very glad. I like I said, I have been waiting a long time for this moment. I think a lot of people in government have, and finally it's here. I think we have a chance to make things much better.
I wholeheartedly agree with you that when we think about broadband connectivity, that is the difference between economically resilient communities. It is the difference between the households that will be able to reinvent themselves when their businesses close. They'll be the ones who can actually weather the storm and be able to, get additional training or get the help from government services or the things that they need. Like we were talking about before we started this Zoom, I think that it's sometimes interesting when people say, oh, well, don't worry, people can call in for help with this 800 number. And a lot of the times to get an 800 number, to get help with government services, you have to be able to get the number from offline. Exactly. So when you're in places where I think here on the mainland, I think a lot of times people, it's second nature to have lots of different ways to connect. Being able to pick up a Wi-Fi signal is very similar to being able to turn on your lights. And I think that the reality is very different when you are on the island. One of the things that I wanted to backtrack to is when you talked about, it is exciting that there is this monumental commitment, not only from the Puerto Rican government, but also the grants and funding that's coming out of the FCC. But before that, before people started getting that funding, what I see is that, or from my point of view, there were a lot of community leaders and local leaders who came up with ways to connect the residents in the hardest to reach communities, whether it be mountainous areas, places that just didn't have reliable electricity. They were the ones who were the inventors and the most creative minds.
I have to agree with that wholeheartedly. And I saw that the mom and pop shops, the small ISP providers, with the small equipment were the ones that connected their communities. And they came forward first to see how they were gonna get things done so that the hospital next door, the doctor, or whoever it was could get at least some sort of servicing. That I have seen firsthand.
And when you think about those stories, what's one that just sticks with you that reminds you about why you're fighting so hard for people to have access?
Well, we actually went on a visit to a hospital in Trujillo, and they were they were providing, they have a big name provider, and they were not able to access. They asked us, it was an official visit, they asked us to help with the provider in giving them service. And I asked, and I said, how are you dealing with everyday things? And they said, well, there's this shop 3 doors down, and he's given us antennas to work with. And I was so surprised. That's why I say I know firsthand. I was so surprised. The hospital was working, the small hospital was working with these antennas from a neighbor 3 doors down that decided, you know, that he was going to free of charge. He was going to do this. The other issue that I has always kept me motivated. Part of the telecommunications bureau of this agency was charged with opening internet centers in all of the municipalities in Puerto Rico and having Wi-Fi connected in the plazas, in the town squares. And when it began, we went to this center in Comerío, which is one of the municipalities in the heart of the mountains in Puerto Rico. And that center has 10 computers, a printer, and we had the opening, and a student came, you know, to see the center, and he said, "This is what a computer looks like." And I was so surprised and moved. I tell you, I got teary-eyed, because I think we assume a lot of things. I think we assume that everybody knows what we know, or they have the experiences that we do. And just to see the excitement of the student, he was about 10 years old, of seeing a computer for the first time. He's like, "This is what a computer looks like." He was so amazed and so thankful to be looking at one. And I was like, "Oh my God, this is what this is all about." Making sure that people have access to this technology and know how to use it.
That's amazing.
Wow, that was a really powerful story. And it sounds like you've had quite a number of experiences that are really lighting a fire, you know, under you, motivating you to fight for change. And I know that you serve on these various committees for the FCC and other associations. So these stories and your status on these committees, how do you think that you've been able to help advance advocacy efforts in this way?
Well, I think it's, for most of them, it's the first time that Puerto Rico sits at the table. And it's a very different tale. The reality of Puerto Rico is very different from other realities, like I expressed before. And I think it's important that we tell those stories, that, you know, not everybody goes from or begins at the same place. Being a lawyer, I think it's important for me to make a point regarding how the definitions in certain laws impact Puerto Rico differently. For example, Puerto Rico most of the time does not fit in the rural definition of most, you know, federal statutes, because Puerto Rico has a very limited territorial extension and a limited metropolitan area in regards to other states. And so a lot of the times we fall through the cracks, whether we are not, you know, taken into consideration in some statutes, or whether the statutes become inapplicable to us because we just don't fit. But most of all, like I said, it's very important to be able to say, for example, I have a very concrete example from now. Supply chain issues for Puerto Rico are really, really doubly hard, because we have to get the supplies from someplace else. And so we have to, you know, compete with other countries or for states to get supplies to Puerto Rico. Supplies to Puerto Rico can only come through certain kinds of ships, American ships, because of cabotage laws. And we have the logistics of bringing it in, and you know. So when there's scarcity, like it happened after Hurricane Maria, for poles, for example, for generators, because Hurricane Harvey had just happened in Texas, and you had all these, where do we get them from? We had to begin, you know, asking for waivers to get non-compliant generators to Puerto Rico with the EPA, to get, you know, other services, poles, there were none to be had. Those types of issues that, when you live in the States, you just look to the next state over, unless you're Hawaii or Alaska. But here you have to, there's no state over. You have to pinpoint where the material is at, how you get it here, how soon can it get here, and all of these issues. And I think that's something that became really apparent after Hurricane Maria, that living in an island setting, it's a whole nother logistic issues that have to be dealt with.
I want to make sure that we lift up a question in the chat. And so, and I'm not sure if Gregory, if you want to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, but I'm happy to read the question that you've dropped in the Q&A. It says that we have an office in KE, Puerto Rico. We are a group of partners and investors that wish to implement communications infrastructure to improve connectivity, to support remote work, education, and health. We would like to work with any municipality to support to support during the COVID pandemic and help build the digital economy. Who can we best contact to work together and build broadband infrastructure to those who need it the most? So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think this is the wonderful thing. We, like I said, we're in the process of getting an administrator for this Puerto Rico infrastructure broadband fund. And that administrator is tasked with choosing stakeholders to sit down at the table and reviving what used to be the Puerto Rican Broadband Task Force, which was composed of private and public agencies, private and public academia, all different stakeholders to come together with the table. And I think that is one of the most important things that the fund is going to bring. Is going to bring a place where we can all sit down and share ideas of how best to go about things, best practices and all of that. I think we have talked about this before. Puerto Rico is doing things very piecemeal. The Department of Education doesn't talk to this agency, and this agency doesn't talk to the, and we need to, you know, sort of, particularly with all of this money coming together, we need to make sure that we are doing things in a way that we do not overbuild or duplicate efforts. And we need to make sure that there's like a centralized point of contact that we can get all together and say, you know, this is what we need to do.
In our last 2 minutes, I just wanted to ask a question to build off of something that you said earlier. And you talked about that Puerto Rico had a broadband plan from 2012 that was updated in 2015. If we were to have this conversation 10 years from now, what does that broadband plan look like?
That broadband plan will incorporate more communities into its observations or goals. I think in government we become too paternalistic and we try to impose on people what we think they need. And sometimes the things that we think people need are not the things that are needed. And I think you have to go down to communities and ask what is needed and what would make the most sense. And I hope that the broadband plan will take more into consideration those communities that are not connected and that have the most to gain from technology and from being connected. That's my hope.
Kat, did you want to jump in with any closing thoughts?
I just had a follow-up question. What are some of the ways to lift up the voices of those communities? Because I would say that we're working with community members. We learned that lesson very early that, you know, we think like this pop-up library is the solution, but in reality, folks wanted to learn digital literacy skills so that they can run their junta meetings better. So how can we lift up more of the like local voices, the folks who are actually impacted by the decisions of government?
I think if you ask me, I think we need to go to the people and not have the assumption or the presumption of people coming to us. And by us, I mean government. We have to do more outreach. We have to be more accessible. I think in Puerto Rico, we have a problem of people trusting their government. They're sort of weary. And I think we need to show that we can be partners and facilitators in many different issues, this being one of them. But it takes effort. It takes the effort of, like I say, coming down and going out.
I just want to make sure that I thank you guys again for getting together for this conversation. This is one of many broadband conversations that we need to have, not only with advocates in Puerto Rico, but some of the Americans in the hardest to reach places that do not have a seat at some of our work group tables. Today, we were lucky enough to have Lucas Peterzak from NCC's team working the Zoom behind the scenes and putting together these beautiful slides. We are grateful for Libraries Without Borders work, and Kat in particular, your voice and literally pushing your organization to maintain its commitment to help the people of Puerto Rico. And Commissioner, I am any day of the week am honored to serve on a work group with you, and so thankful that you joined us today. So thank you guys for all taking time off of your early lunch break, and I hope that we can do this again. And again, Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you. We appreciate you. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Franchella. I appreciate you too. It has been an honor to serve with you. It has been an honor to know you, Catherine, and anything I can be of help to you or to anybody that wants to reach out and make Puerto Rico better, they have a friend in me.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.